Thank you so much. All right, so welcome to the NSP Closeout uh, webinar. Today we're going to be focusing our attention on land banks. The PowerPoint has been posted for the session the link is going to be included into the chat. But it's posted out onto the HUD Exchange. The webinar materials, including the PowerPoint, the recording of the session, and transcripts will be posted on the HUD Exchange website in approximately 7 to 14 days. Today, today's webinar is being presented by myself, Jamie Abbott. I am a consultant with ICF with hands-on experience administrating the NSP at the state of Missouri and with Jefferson City, an entitlement community. I will be joined by my co-host, Stan Bitterman of Urban Ventures, who has been working with the Neighborhood Stabilization Program since its inception. And finally, Duncan Yetman with the HUD's Office of Block Grant Assistance. Our agenda for today's webinar, we will hear from Duncan Yetman, and then we will move on to covering land banking with an emphasis on closing out the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. We will highlight tools and resources, which are all available on the HUD Exchange website. And towards the end of the webinar, we will provide some time to cover questions that are submitted to the Q&A box. Today's webinar is just one in the NSP Closeout series, covering updates to the NSP Closeout requirements, key considerations of best use of program income, and disposition of land banks. This presentation will cover land banking closeout considerations and resource tools available on the HUD Exchange. This webinar will provide a high-level overview of each topic and resources for you to look into, depending on which NSP topics you would like to dive deeper into. In the NSP Closeout series, we had previously covered several topics covering the NSP Closeout overview, the NSP Program Income Closeout, and then today's session, as you know, is on NSP Land Bank Closeout. The webinar series is help to ensure grantees understand the closeout process for each topic and will include the training webinar like the one you're on right now and a 60-minute office hour session. Webinar participants are automatically registered for the office hours session. We will answer your questions about NSP land banking closeout process today during the Q&A session of this training. We encourage grantees with more in-depth questions or specific questions related to your NSP program, DRGR, closeout status, etc., to join us on July 27th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. During the office hour session, we will have more time to dive into your specific NSP questions. I will now hand the presentation over to Duncan. Duncan?
Thanks, Jamie. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Duncan Yetman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Entitlement Communities Division here in the Office of Block Grant Assistance at HUD. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to the 2023 NSP Closeout webinar series. HUD is excited once again to be offering this webinar series as part of our continuing effort to provide technical assistance to our grantees looking to close out their NSP1, NSP2, and NSP3 grants. Today's session focuses on land banks. That odd, but not that odd activity, a little different from CDBG, that allowed NSP grantees to establish and operate land banks for homes that have been foreclosed upon, that eligible use category C. We are hoping that what you get from today's session is that you're going to begin to continue to think strategically about how you can use the property within your land bank, and how you can prepare for closeout of your entire grant, and do that in a way that makes sense for the properties within your land bank. So without further ado, let me pass it back over to Jamie. And again, encourage you to ask questions today, and welcome again to our NSP Closeout webinar series. Jamie?
Thanks, Duncan. Okay, so the goal of today's webinar is to get grantees thinking about actions and steps to facilitate closing. Many grantees have experienced staff turnover since the inception of the NSP program, so may not be aware of the state of their NSP program or the status of their land bank program. We will also identify resources that will guide grantees through the closeout, including considerations of program income. But first, we're going to have some polling questions for everyone. I'm going to ask my colleague John to launch the first poll. Okay, so which NSP grants do you have open? Select all that apply. Do you have NSP 1, which is a formula? NSP 2, which was a competitive? Or NSP 3, which was also a formula grant? Or D, unsure? And give some time for the grantees to make their responses. Okay. And the results are in. Well, it's pretty much spread evenly. We have approximately 19 individuals that have NSP 1, with 4 having NSP 2, and 15 with NSP 3. Now, for those who are unsure, you could always reach out to your CPD representative with HUD to get clarifications, or take a look within DRGR for that clarification. All right. Poll number 2. Are you ready to close out all of your open NSP grants within the next 6 months? You can answer yes, no, or unsure. Give a few more seconds to enter in your answer. All right. So once again, the questions, the responses are pretty much even out across all 3. It's okay if you're unsure about whether or not you're ready to close out in the next 6 months. The item, or the key takeaway here, is to be thinking about getting and facilitating to closing out your NSP program. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and move on. What is a land bank? So land banks are public or nonprofit entities created to acquire, manage, maintain, and repurpose foreclosed properties. Land banks may have already been formed prior to the inception of the NSP grantees program, or formed as part of the program, but every community is different. The entity's organizing documents must include land banking as one area of focus or purpose, as part of its mission. For the NSP program, a key takeaway is that the property must have met the definition of a foreclosed home or residential property at the time of acquisition. NSP land banking requirements. With HUD encouraging grantees to facilitate closeout of their NSP program, properties may remain in the land bank at the time of closeout. The disposition of each NSP-funded property in the land bank must occur within 10 years of the date of the closeout agreement. Grantees will need to develop a feasible plan for maintenance and stewardship of the land banked properties for the 10-year period. The funding may include program income or other sources to support these activities. If the properties remain at or after the 10-year period, the properties then transfer to the Community Development Block Grant Program and loses the NSP identity and flexibility. For example, NSP program allows for 100 to 20% area median income, but the CDBG program's max is 80% area median income. One area to note, all properties held in a land bank after closing NSP is still subject to future monitoring for compliance. So we have another polling question. How many NSP land banked properties does your program have? Less than 15, 15 to 30 properties, 30 or more properties, or D, unsure. We'll give a few more seconds. Let's see, and the results are, we have 12 who are in attendance who have less than 15 NSP land bank properties. We have 2 in attendance that have between 15 to 30 properties, and 8 that have 30 or more properties within their portfolio. And then there are 4 who are unsure of the status of their NSP portfolio. Great, thank you for participating in that poll. So with that, we will discuss the LH25 requirement. The NSP program requires at least 25% of the grantees NSP 1, 2, or 3 line of credit must have been expended to house individuals or families whose income does not exceed 50% of the area median income. The same requirement applies to the program income expended of $250,000 or more annually. HUD encourages grantees to meet this requirement before closeout. Grantees have an option, however, to close out their grant and demonstrate within 3 years of closeout that they have met the 25% set-aside requirement for program income earned as of the date of the closeout agreement. If the grantee takes advantage of the 3-year option, disposition plans must take compliance into consideration. The LH25 compliance is determined by occupancy and meeting a national objective. Land banked properties cannot meet the LH25 requirement based on future development plans. So, what are the available national objectives? They are housing, area benefit, and limited clientele. The Housing National Objective provides or improves permanent residential structures that will be occupied by a household whose income is at or below 120% of the area median income. Keep in mind, this is the national objective that must be used to meet the LH25 set-aside requirement. The area benefit applies to a residential area whose 50% whose 51% of the residents have incomes at or below 120% area median income. Most frequently, demolition is an area benefit. Activities assisting businesses serving a targeted area, such as providing goods and services in an LMMA trade area, can also be considered an area benefit. Limited clientele serves a limited clientele whose incomes are at or below 120% of the area median income, such as a homeless shelter or group home. Now, the jobs LMMJ national objective applies only to the NSP1 grant. The focus of this national objective is to create or maintain jobs for persons with incomes at or below 120% AMI. Now back to thinking about closing out the NSP program. Grantees will need to determine their LH25 requirement. Remember, this requirement is based on funds expended and that the property meets a national objective. Grantees must identify every property acquired with NSP funding that has yet to meet a NSP national objective. This inventory is going to be a part of the NSP closeout agreement with HUD. So once the inventory is completed, properties should be reviewed for disposition that can be completed prior to closeout. This would reduce the number of parcels in the land bank, thereby minimizing the ongoing maintenance and administrative costs. Creation of a land bank management plan and management plan for continued affordability will be discussed later in the presentation. Many grantees will have records identifying all the NSP funded acquisitions currently in the land bank. DRGR records will tell us what properties were initially acquired as land banked property. However, not all grantees kept the system up to date as properties were developed or redeveloped and met a national objective. In these cases, grantees will need to work with the land banks to identify all parcels acquired with NSP funds that have not yet met a national objective. Provided that record retention requirements were followed, a file should exist for each acquisition, either on paper or digital. Grantee staff will likely need to work with the record retention staff for their jurisdiction to gain access to those paper files. Next, grantees will need to identify actions to be taken. Are there properties that can easily be disposed of? Have all the properties have activities identified? Have all the properties identify the activities that will need to be taken to meet a national objective? Are those activities still feasible? And finally, grantees will need to create a land management plan. So what are the options for land banked properties? There are 4 main options available, which include making the properties available for redevelopment by a third party, having a land bank redevelop the sites. The parcels could be donated to neighboring landowners, or a combination of one or more of the above items. Now, these options will all have varying timeframes, and those timeframes should be taken in consideration as part of the winding down of the NSP program and or for meeting the 10-year disposition requirement after closeout. So the land bank management plan we have previously mentioned several times. Now, prior to the NSP closeout, grantees must develop the property by property plan for disposing of each of the NSP land bank property and for meeting the NSP national objective for each within the 10-year period. The plan should also include the following elements, such as the authority of who oversees the land bank, along with the contact information. Identify the roles and responsibilities of the land bank personnel. and the roles and responsibilities of the NSP grantee and the oversight of the NSP properties. The plan should also include an inventory of properties, including the acquisition date and their proposed uses, along with the projected timeline and milestones to be met. And finally, the national objective that the property will meet. Okay, as part of the national objective, just keep in mind in developing the plan that what requirements the grantee will need to meet, or the threshold, I should say, of meeting the LH25 set-aside requirement. That should always be in the back of the mind when developing the disposition plan. All right, with that, I am now going to hand the presentation off to my co-host, Stan Fitterman. Stan, welcome.
Thank you, Jamie. Let's see if I have control yet. Not yet. But if you could advance it, Jamie, to the next one
Okay.
while we
Control,
get John's
Stan.
attention. I do?
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So let's talk about redevelopment. And basically, we're talking about home ownership, rental development, mixed use, or demolition and clearance. So land bank maintenance and development. We're going to need to make sure we have some money set aside if we're going to be holding on these properties for a while in our redevelopment plan. We have some money set aside for ongoing maintenance. Our lawn isn't going to mow itself. If there's a building, we're going to need to make sure that it stays secure and safe. Someone's going to have to insure the site. So part of our land bank management plan needs to be how are we going to maintain these properties while we work to redevelop them. Most of our money's got to go to serve low mod income populate households. They're going to need that redevelopment is going to need subsidy in order to redevelop. More than likely, you're going to need some types of subsidy so that they're either we're getting affordable rental or we have some purchase assistance available for affordable home ownership. Sources are the ones that y'all are all familiar with. We could use our home money for those of us that get home. Home ARC, which is a plan that for folks mainly for homeless, housing for homeless, at risk of homelessness, fleeing domestic violence, people have previously been homeless. But again, another potential source if we're redeveloping vacant land or an adaptive reuse of an old building. CDBG, can't use new construction, but we could do some rehab or the clearance aspect of it. LIHTC, always a possibility if there's a demand for it, if we have sites that are large enough to be able to do a larger rental deal of 40 to 60 to 100 units. And let's face it, for our nonprofits, if our land banks and works with nonprofits, they can use foundations are starting to get involved in housing a little bit more than ever. Capital campaigns can be used. And while it's not on the list, a state or local housing trust fund could also be used. We're talking about anything that would help us redevelop the site to meet a national objective. Okay. Post closeout requirements. Now, I know that today's problem is getting to closeout. 10 years from now's problem is what we're going to do with this land. But really, I would like to encourage everyone, if you've got a land bank management plan and you've put those milestones and a timeline in it, have some type of system in-house for following up and making sure that the land bank is meeting those timelines and on track to meet those milestones. Even if they're a little bit behind, that might be okay. We just want to make sure that they're showing progress and doing what we said they were going to do in the land bank management plan. And in terms of redevelopment, we talked about for continued affordability, we've got to report annually after it's developed. We want to check our consolidated plan to see what we said we were going to use in terms of enforcing affordability, remembering that many of us use the home program as the safe harbor for those continued affordability requirements. And speaking of continued affordability, properties for rental, they got to be made available to income eligible residents, just like all the other programs you administer. It's got to be restricted to affordable amounts established by the action plan or the substantial amendments. We need to enforce with rental, we have to enforce our affordability period with deed restrictions or restrictive covenants. In addition to, usually folks also have a note and mortgage or a deed and trust and note with those. And of course, we're going to do income verification prior to occupancy to make sure that folks are eligible. Home ownership, we're going to run it like our regular purchase assistance programs, right? Income verification prior to the sale. We're going to review that it's being used as their primary residence, that someone hasn't moved out or is renting the place. And again, we're going to enforce this affordability period through a note and mortgage or deed of trust. All right, so troubleshooting. Current land use and zoning requirements are going to be some of our biggest hurdles, some of our biggest obstacles potentially to redevelop. Most land use and zoning codes have valid non-conforming uses. So if a lot was developed, but it doesn't meet the setbacks from the front or the side lot line because it's too small, or if it was a rental property and it did not have enough parking spaces for the new code, but it had enough when it was built, when we discontinue that use, most of us have done, because that's why we own it. When we discontinue that new use, we lose our grandfathered status. So when we redevelop, we have to redevelop to the current codes. Sometimes those codes make the new development of a site impractical based on lot size or shape, or cost prohibitive with parking. Sure, you could build parking underneath your building. The cost might be so high that you would not be able to actually develop to a point where it's economically feasible. We've also got neighborhoods where there might be limited demand for housing, or I should say limited economic demand for housing. Not enough people with enough money to be able to buy or rent what we're planning to build. Development costs may exceed appraised values, especially can be a challenge in with ownership. Remembering that if we're combining this with home can pay for that developer gap, that developer subsidy is an eligible home use, the difference between total development costs and appraised value. There may be a lack of available subsidy to make the units affordable. Some of these sites may very well have environmental constraints, given that we still hold on to them, we still have them, we haven't redeveloped. Usually that means something's going to be wrong with some of these sites. It's going to be difficult to redevelop for some reason. And let's face it, we've had turnover, and we've got a lot of folks running NSP, or who now all of a sudden came to work one day and had a note on had an email from the boss saying, oh, by the way, I need you to close out NSP, not having had any previous experience with the program. All right, so let's look at how we could deal with one zoning problem. We've got a side, we've got a lot, whoops, I went ahead too fast, excuse me. Here we go. A property remaining their land bank, it's a size and shape that makes it difficult to redevelop. It's in a low mod area. The lot is small, it's shaped oddly. We couldn't figure out how to fit, we could get a house on it, it could only be 10 feet wide. So what are options? Well, we could implement a side lot disposition policy. So we're in a low mod area, so we would meet the low mod area national objective, and we could in fact give it to transfer the parcel to a neighboring property owner. They would have slightly more land. We will have met our LMA national objective. Here's a situation that some of you may find yourself in. You've got some vacant land bank properties that are in neighborhoods that are in pretty rough shape. This one, almost a third of our example here, almost a third of the buildings are abandoned, have signs of serious physical deterioration. Very few homes, or we got no home sales in the last 12 months. We've got property values that are assessed values that are lower than other parts of the city. So we may have a challenge in developing this site and with some of our regular programs. So what are some options here? Well, first we need to identify the target market. Oftentimes in neighborhoods that have had a lot of disinvestment, the folks that are still in the neighborhood are our target market. And often they're still in the neighborhood because they didn't have high enough income to leave. So we're often talking about We're going to be targeting our programs and targeting our target market is going to be folks who are extremely low income. So then we need to identify what subsidies are we going to use, do we have available to redevelop the site, keeping in mind that we need to look at what we expect our target market to earn and make sure we design our price point or our rents at an amount that they would be able to afford. So more than likely, we're going to have to do deep subsidies on rental housing or have purchase assistance that's higher than we usually do in order to have enable folks to move into the product we're building. And we've got some links here that y'all have access to on the single family development and sales program manual that was written for the NSP program, and also a couple of publications on creating NSP eligible rental houses and using rental to meet the low mod set aside. I'm sorry, the very low set aside. And blighted property, here's another example. We've got several land bank structures that meet the local definition of blighted and a concentrated neighborhood demolition plan. The target area is at least 51% low mod. We can use then our reuse, be able to demolish those structures using the low mod area national objective. And then the demolition activity improves the area because we got rid of all these bad buildings or some of these bad buildings. And then we could the cleared property can be sold, donated. We could do a small park if our Parks and Recreation Department would allow that, a small park. Or we could sell or donate it to a nonprofit that would in turn redevelop the site. Now, one of the things to be mindful of is this is not that we need to make sure we're monitoring our LH 25 requirement when making decisions about tearing down blighted properties. Okay. All right, I think I'm flipping it back to Jamie.
Thanks, Dan. Wanted to take a few moments to cover some of the tools and resources that are available to the grantees. Here we have a list of websites or notices that are beneficial to review as part of considering or facilitating the closeout of the NSP program. And these include the recent CPD Notice 22-14, which includes the instructions for the closeout instructions for the Community Development Block Grant Program, which has a section on NSP within that notice, along with a notice of changes to NSP closeout requirements related to program income, the clarifications of requirements for quarterly performance reports, notice of changes to the NSP closeout requirements related to program income. I believe that was a duplication, apologize there. NSP closeout guide, along with a NSP closeout process and guidance page. And then recently, websites has been added to the website is a closeout status indicator report and a NSP monthly financial update report. So I mentioned on the previous slide about the NSP closeout process and guidance. This is a very handy tool to help grantees think about the 25% set aside requirements, questions that may have around land banks. I do want to take a moment here to mention that HUD will be issuing a land bank closeout guidance tool here shortly in the near future. So keep an eye out for a notification from the HUD Exchange listserv distribution email. All right. Along with the program income and quarterly performance reporting, I mentioned previously about a report on what to do with your QPRs. There may have been quarterly performance reports that have been missed in previous quarters. So this website will guide you through what would need to be taken or what actions will need to be taken to get the grantee current with HUD on the reporting. And then finally, the disaster recovery grant. There may be some questions on which reports that need to be utilized to facilitate the closeout and or trying to figure out which properties funds have been expended on. Okay, so grantees can request on-call technical assistance from HUD, but first would need to work with your CPD representative or your local field office prior to submitting the request through the HUD Exchange website. Okay, now we are at the point for us to review questions that may have been resubmitted through the Q&A chat box. And I'm going to go ahead and invite Stan and Duncan to join me in answering some questions, which I am going to go ahead and start off the questions. Stan, can the NSP program be closed with land bank properties still existing in the portfolio?
Yes, yes, and you can, and you've got 10 years in order to figure out how to redevelop them. We're hoping that you would redevelop them. I'm personally hoping you redevelop them sooner than that. And then at the end of 10 years, you lose some of the NSP flexibility when the properties would be flipped to the regular CDBG entitlement.
Yeah, and so the 10 years date, is there what triggers that 10 years?
You asked a lot of questions. Isn't it the close 10 years? It's 10 years from the closeout, correct?
Yeah, it's 10 years from the date of the closeout agreement with HUD.
Yeah, right.
Thanks, Duncan.
Sure.
Thank you, Duncan.
So here's a question to either Stan or Duncan. Is the land management plan and the management plan for continuing affordability the same thing?
No, they're not the same thing. No, so grantees operating a land bank need to submit a plan detailing how they are going to meet that 10-year maximum land holding requirement and fulfill that and dispose of all those properties within that 10-year period following the date of the closeout agreement. Separate and apart from that, grantees also need to have a continuing affordability management plan for how they're going to continue to ensure that the properties that they have developed with NSP funds will continue to meet the affordability requirements of the program.
Thanks, Duncan. So the management plan for continuing affordability, as you mentioned, is a separate document, but it's actually it's completed utilizing the HUD form 40181. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to take a moment to remind all the participants to submit their Q&A questions to the box so that we may assist in answering your NSP questions. So Stan, yes. How would you suggest trying to figure out existing land bank properties?
Well, I think DRGR, hopefully they're in that. If not, another way is to, see what the land bank owns through your local, property assessor's office and type in the name of the land bank and search and see how many properties are in title of the land bank authority. And go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's a really good point is researching via the name of the land bank properties through the local assessor's office.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Hopefully that they would show up.
And also maybe going ahead and taking a look at previous quarterly performance reports or the QPRs I was mentioning earlier. to compare to, you know, what's on the QPR and compared to what's the internal paper records may have.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that most of the NSP grantees do not have the staff that was there at the inception of the NSP program. So I'm sure there's lots of barriers or lots
It's
of
institutional hurdles. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that would need to be taken.
But you know, we didn't say the most obvious one is ask the Land Bank Authority for the list of what they own.
Right.
And you know that and what was purchased, and then try and compare that. If they don't have records to show what was bought with NSP, try and compare that with your records to see what you might have purchased.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to another question here. The LH25 set-aside requirement, does that have to be met prior to closeout? So Duncan or Stan, which one of you would like to take that on?
So LH25 needs to be met within 3 years of closeout. There should be a plan in place how that LH25 requirement will be met at the time of closeout. As was mentioned during today's webinar, a plan that includes the future disposition of NSP assisted properties in a land bank. That future disposition of those properties in a land bank, those can't be included in the calculation of having met the LH25 requirement. Not until a property is actually disposed of can you actually include it, you know, in meeting that LH25 requirement if it's disposed of in such a way that it will do so, you know. So it's you know, yeah, so LH25 is something that has to be addressed, if not by closeout, or if not,
Thereafter.
at least within 3 years.
Thanks, Duncan.
Sure.
What are the reporting requirements after closeout?
I
Stan?
don't know. What are the reporting requirements after
Well,
Well, there's so your quarterly reporting requirements upon closeout become an annual performance report and an APR that the grantee will submit. In that APR, you will update HUD as to the status of properties within your land bank. Were some disposed of within the past year? If so, what, you know, to what end, what national objective did they meet, et cetera, and so forth. You will update HUD through your APR on the status of properties within your land bank, on the status of properties that are continuing to have to meet the affordability requirements, all of that. You know, it's important that, you know, that report be submitted annually.
great. Thank you. We do have a question. Wondering if we covered what, okay, did you all cover that remnant property is not properly land bank unless you have a land bank program / plan? Let's see.
Yeah, Rob. Okay. I think what Rob is getting at in terms of remnant property is property that may be what some at HUD have referred to as an informal land bank. And we don't regard such property. First of all, we don't regard informal land banks, although I know that that term has been bandied about at HUD in the past. We're really trying to get away from that. These are properties that were initially developed under one of the other categories, not eligible use C, within the NSP program. You know, those need to be addressed outside of a land bank management plan. And at closeout, it may need to be a situation where those properties are disposed of. If you know, as Rob notes here, they're considered remnant, that they're not really viable to develop in any other way or fashion. Yeah, but grantees with questions about properties that, for lack of a better term, they are land banking, but they're not really part of eligible use category C. They should have that discussion with their field office rep about that, especially if they have a significant number of those properties.
Now, I'll add that some of those same redevelopment issues are going to apply in terms of valid non-conforming use, lots that are too small, not having a strong market.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one thing overall is that there's a reason these properties haven't been redeveloped yet. I mean, they've been around for a long time. So there's often going to be some complications, I think, with most of these of trying to get them redeveloped.
Mhm.
Okay. Not seeing any additional questions in the Q&A box, so please, if you have a question, go ahead and submit it into the Q&A box so we may take the time to answer your question. It could be on land banks, it could be on anything within the NSP program itself. There was a within the chat, you know, someone indicating that they're very new to the program, to the NSP program as a grantee. So I do want to just take a moment to stress to visit all of those tools and resources that were listed out on this page. The HUD Exchange website has a lot of trainings that can be search with the search word of NSP, narrow down all the trainings related to the NSP program, along with the NSP closeout process and guidance, which includes links to those resources of those webinar trainings or guidance documents, items of that nature that is very beneficial to even down to the topic, meaning like program income, you know, and quarterly performance or issues with navigating the DRGR, the disaster recovery grant reporting database, which is utilized for drawing the NSP funds.
Would you like me to address that question that's in the chat, Jamie?
Sure.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Sure. So, how long is annual reporting required after closeout? Annual reporting is required for as long as you have properties that need to meet the affordability requirements. Now, as Stan mentioned, you know, we set up under the home rule, the home program rules, a safe harbor for how long property needed to remain affordable that received NSP assistance. Several grantees, though, have far and away exceeded those safe harbors. I have seen management of continuing affordability plans that have properties that will require a grantee to report for the next 50 years. Believe it or not. As long as you have properties within your program that have affordability requirements that go out that long, and again, it was the grantee prerogative to determine what those affordability requirements were. We again just set up a safe harbor for you that established a minimum that you needed to do, but several grantees went out much further than that. So as long as you need to continue to meet the affordability requirements that you set up at the beginning of the program for all the properties you assisted, that's how long your annual reporting will be. Remember, when you close the grant, your grant will be marked as closed with ongoing reporting. It won't be formally closed without that notation until all of those affordability requirements have been met.
That's a very good point, to Duncan, about the affordability period. So maybe a local policies and procedures document may need to be developed to make sure that all the future NSP staff are aware of the annual reporting requirements.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Okay, so we did get a question in, which states, we are considering donating land properties to third parties to redevelop as affordable housing for LMMI households. At what point is disposition considered over for the purposes of NSP? If no NSP funds are used by the third party developer and the property meets the national objective for disposition, would the developer still need to follow all NSP requirements, such as the requirement that the properties cannot be sold for more than the total development cost? So there's a couple questions there to address. So at what point is disposition considered over?
Right. They're meeting an LMMH national objective with the disposition of these properties, correct?
Let's see here. So
Yes,
we're doing
develop as affordable housing. Yeah. So
Yeah.
LMH.
Yeah.
yes.
So
You're not going to meet that national objective until the units are built.
Mm-hmm.
mhm.
And that the proper household is
It's moved in,
been
right.
documented and residing within the property.
Yeah. So then they've met. They're basically, what they're doing with this property is they've acquired it. It's in their land bank. Doesn't meet a national objective until another action is taken, which is uses B or E2, which is to develop it. So once that national objective has been met by that disposition and that development, once that occupancy occurs, then a national objective has been met. And then they can stop reporting on that property, but there does need to be, I mean, it's no longer reported as part of their land bank, but it is reported as part of continuing affordability requirements, right?
Right. So essentially what I'm hearing, Duncan, is that the NSP requirements will stay with the property regardless of the other uses of funds, because NSP funds were utilized to acquire the property. So there's NSP ties, and so the ongoing NSP requirements, such as the continued affordability, would still need to be kept up after after the property has been sold and or rented to qualifying households.
Right.
Right. Okay. All right. So with that, we will go ahead. I wanted to remind everyone about the NSP trainings. We have the office hours set for this Thursday, July 27th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We encourage grantees to join us Thursday, as we will have more time to dive into your program-specific questions related to your NSP program, DRGR, closeout status, and obviously land banking questions. Just a reminder that today's webinar was just one in the NSP closeout series, covering the updates to the NSP closeout requirements, key considerations of best use of program income, and disposition of land banks. The webinar materials, including the PowerPoint, recording of the session, and transcripts will be posted on the HUD Exchange website within approximately 7 to 14 days, so be sure to check out the HUD Exchange. How to reach us. Find us on the HUD Exchange website by typing NSP into the search bar, and it'll display a link to the NSP program page. You can contact your CPD representative, or you can email us at nsp-questions@hud.gov. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.